Cool. Then in your notes, you're going to add the ribs. Like such. Diaphragm, section of skeletal muscle. When the diaphragm contracts, it drives down in the body cavity. As it drives down in the body cavity, what does that do to volume of the chest?
Increases.
Increases the volume. Why is that important?
Because the pressure decreases.
Yep. Okay, so you get a volume increase, which then leads to a pressure decrease. And so it actually drives the air into your lungs is atmospheric pressure. Because for this to stay constant, if this increases, then this has to decrease. And that change in pressure, then the pressure inside of your lungs becomes less than atmospheric pressure, and therefore there's a difference in pressure, and water, well, I hope not, air drives into the lungs. Right where I wanted it. Do you still need this?
But just a little bit longer.
How about now? Cool. So that's inhaling. So then exhaling is the opposite. So this is question 4a, isn't it? Yep. So these are the intercostal muscles that we talked about earlier. This is the muscle tissue that you eat when you eat ribs, if you guys are rib eaters. So these are the intercostal muscles, and what they do is they contract. Exhalation has nothing to do with the diaphragm. The diaphragm actually relaxes. It's the muscles in between your ribs that contract, and that actually brings the rib cage in. What does that do to your chest volume?
Decreases.
Sure, decreases the volume in the chest. Oh, let's go ahead and call that a cavity.
Do the intercostal muscles have to do anything when you breathe in?
They relax. Intercostal muscles and the diaphragm are what we call an antagonistic pair. They're opposites. So when one is contracting, the other is relaxing. Similar, and this is extremely common in muscle groups, in that when the bicep contracts, that brings the arm up, and then the tricep is relaxed. To then open the joint, the bicep relaxes, and the tricep contracts. So muscles work in opposite pairs, what we call antagonistic pairs. And that's what reverses the work of the other muscle group. Okay, so then if you draw your ribs again, the ribs then drive inward. And of course, this is dramatic, right? Your ribs shouldn't cave in as much. So since the ribs drive in, this actually pulls the diaphragm up, but the diaphragm here is relaxed. Since the diaphragm is relaxed and the ribs drive in, your volume decreases. I'm just going to keep talking about Boyle's law. P1, V1, P2, V2. If this side stays constant, and the other side has to increase or decrease proportionately. So here we are having a volume decrease. Oh man, we put that in the wrong spot. There's the mistake for today. At least it wasn't on your registrations. This is a volume decrease. There we go. Which makes pressure increase. And since there is an increased atmospheric pressure in your chest, the air then drives out. Boyle's law. Super simple. So figure 42 something, 42 we were just talking about earlier, 4225 deals with this. So let's get that little baby out here. May I take this?
Yes.
Cool. So this is the anatomical part of the diagram that we did earlier on Friday. How the structures actually look, whereas here, this is how these structures function. So you have air intake here, okay? So this is inhaling here. So this handout is all about Boyle's law. Like such, okay? So in inhalation, when you are inhaling, you have the diaphragm here. Where's my Sharpie? So you have the diaphragm here. When the diaphragm contracts, the diaphragm drives down. So this structure here, and then this structure here. It's a skeletal muscle. It's the diaphragm. Okay, and that would be here, and that would be here. Okay, so when you are inhaling, the diaphragm contracts. When the diaphragm contracts, the diaphragm drives down. Okay, since the diaphragm is contracting, the intercostal muscles are relaxing, and so your ribs expand a little bit when you breathe. It's more important actually that when your intercostal muscles relax, then your lungs actually push out on the ribs. I don't want you thinking that you are pushing your ribs out, okay? You don't have that ability, all right? What you have the ability to do is tighten your intercostal muscles, and that then compresses your rib cage. If you want your ribs to then go back out, all you do is relax, and because of the sternum and the tension that the sternum creates, then the ribs re-expand. Okay, so this is inhalation. I think the green should be okay. Yeah.
Wait, sternum? What's that?
Sternum is the is this cartilage shield. The sternum's about that big, and it connects the thoracic ribs as they wrap around and connect here. Okay, and so it's this ovular piece of cartilage that actually connects the bones of your ribs here, and it gives your rib cage tension. Okay, so that way when you contract the intercostal muscles and you bring the rib cage in, right, there's no opposite or antagonistic muscle group to pull those ribs back out. Okay, but there's the physical tension that is caused by pulling against the sternum. So when the intercostal muscles relax, the rib cage then returns to its original position. You can't sit here and flare your rib cage out and you go, well, sure, I'll go like that. Well, you're driving your shoulders back and bending your spine. That's not expanding your ribs. You can bring your rib cage in and then you just relax and it re-expands. Yeah, that's one of the things that open heart surgery people don't understand, that in order to work on the heart, they take a circular drill. It's a grinder is what it actually is. It's a masonry tool, and they cut right down your sternum. Okay, and then they put a ratcheted clamp, but it's reversed in that cut, and then they crank the wheel. And they're called rib spreaders, and they force your ribs apart. Then they work on the chest cavity, and then they turn the handle, and the ribs come back together, and then they staple your sternum back together, and then wait for the cartilage to grow back. It's also extremely common if someone has CPR done for a long period of time, that it cracks the sternum. So when the patient wakes up afterwards, just about every breath is really painful. You know, it's, ow, 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 right? But the fact that your sternum hurts and that you're aware of it is good news, because that means you're alive. So I agree that it's painful, but the good news is you're feeling it. Inhalation. All right, so in inhalation, the diaphragm contracts. While the intercostal muscles, and I'll abbreviate here, relax. These are opposite, or what we call antagonistic muscle groups. And so when one is contracted, the other is relaxed. Right? And then you simply reverse the process. So here, this is exhalation. Okay, so here, instead of the diaphragm contracting, the diaphragm will relax. And here, how do I spell that? It's intercostal. Okay. Here, the intercostal muscles contract. These are simply opposites, is all they are. Simple.
Are you trying to think about my breathing today?
Yes. Trying to get them to think about something. Cool. Any questions about this before we leave it? So notes. You guys good? Cool. Take a picture of those and post that later. All right. So now we need to tackle section 5, the nervous system. Boom, 2 more sections and we're done with core 6. So it says neurons or nerves, same thing. Neurons transmit electrical impulses, which are nerve impulses, which are action potentials. And the myelination, which this is just a protein, we'll talk about it in just one second. The myelination of nerve fibers allows for saltatory conduction. Really fancy word, okay? Saltatory is from the Latin root saltare. Have you ever skipped a rock across the surface of water? You ever thrown a rock across a lake or a pond or the bay? You ever done this, right? And the rock skips across the surface.
I've tried.
Okay, right. If the angle isn't right, then the rock basically just goes into the water. So whenever something hops or skips, that's from the Latin root saltare, or it could be saltar. I don't speak Latin. And so since the action potential doesn't move directly across the neuron, what you guys will find out is it actually hops from exposed membrane area. And so since the nerve impulse hops across the membrane, we call this saltatory conduction. It's just a vocabulary term. Super straightforward. All right, so let's dig into the nervous system then. Top of the page, boom. So this would be 5A. So if you look at this as if you're looking at the back of your head, okay? So the brain and the brain stem comes down like this. So you're looking at the back of someone's head. So here's the brain. Then there is a bundle of nerves that come out the bottom of the brain that we call the spinal cord. Okay, the spinal cord is not one giant cell. It's not the way it works. Think of it as rope. If you've ever looked at rope, rope is made of just hundreds and hundreds of little fibers, okay? It's exactly what your spinal cord is. If you were to take the spinal cord and cut it and you look at it, it's just this bundle of, well, thousands actually, of nerve cells. So rope and the spinal cord are the same, okay? And then coming off of the spinal cord here, there are nerves that then come off of the spinal cord like this. There are holes in the side of the vertebrae, and they allow these nerves to then radiate out from the spinal cord. I don't know if you've ever seen vertebrae up close. They are not solid. On each side, there's a hole about the size of your pinky, and that allows the nerves to radiate out. So there are 2 portions to your nervous system. You ever heard of the CNS? Do you know what the CNS is for your nervous system?
Central nervous system.
Yes, this is your central nervous system, okay? Meaning the center of it, how I've done it in green. Whereas to be on the side is called to be on the periphery. So we call these nerves that radiate out from the spinal cord, this is your peripheral nervous system. So there's two major parts to your nervous system. There's your brain, your spinal cord, that's your central nervous system, and then the nerves that radiate out from that and all the way down the back of your legs, and that is on the edge, so we refer to it as your peripheral nervous system. So when you look at the brain, another color, use black. When you look at the brain on top here, so if you have the brain here, there's information going out of and then back to the brain. What's the difference between the information going out and the information coming back? What kind of information do you think we call that? Why would there be information leaving your brain? What is that information doing?
Telling your muscles what to do.
Telling your muscles what to do, telling your organs what to do, telling your skin and your blood vessels, and telling every cell in the body what to do. Therefore, what do you call the person who is then telling everybody else what to do? What's that called when you can then make other things do what you want?
Leader.
How about control? The information leaving the brain is controlling information. Telling the muscles what to do, telling the organs what to do, telling the blood vessels what to do, telling your glands, the thyroid and your testicles or your ovaries or your adrenal glands. It's all control coming out of the brain. But then what information is coming back to the brain?
Like pain.
Sure, pain, sight, smell, pressure, texture.
Response.
Response, sensory. So when we talk about nerve impulses and we talk about action potentials, all too often students get focused that it's just information coming out of the brain, that the impulses are just coming out of the brain. It's a two-way street. There is just as much information coming back to the brain, in fact, sometimes more information coming back to the brain to be processed as there is leaving the brain for control, okay? We spend so much time talking about the brain output that a lot of people don't stop and consider brain input, okay? This is just as important as this, okay? And actually, sensory information is more complicated because the sensory information, once it arrives, it then has to be processed. And it then has to be matched with all of the other sensory information. Okay, that's why, I don't know, it's probably, well, when we drove up to Em's apartment a month ago, right? I had sensory information that was going back to my brain through my eyes, and I had different sensory information that was being sent to my brain from my middle ear. They didn't match. My middle ear said I was in this position, and my eye said I was in this position. And thus I got this ripping headache and really bad nausea. Why? Because the sensory information, when it was being processed, and there's just tremendous amounts of biochemistry there, that information didn't match biochemically, and then that causes physiological effects on the rest of the body. The brain is just fascinating. All right, so when we talk about this whole system, don't forget that this whole system is made of billions of individual cells that the lay person calls a nerve, and that in science we refer to as a neuron. You say, why a different word? And I say, I don't know. I wish I did. Then the layperson then calls the impulse, the nerve impulse here, or the message that is carried back and forth, is actually called an action potential. So sometimes in my shorthand, you will see me write AP. That's for action potential. And you will hear people say, oh, you know, nerve impulses happen at the speed of light. You know, first of all, nothing moves at the speed of light except for light and electricity, which is a different form of light. That's a whole other discussion. But the action potential actually moves at right around 200 miles an hour. Henry, you use the English system. Yes, I did. That's how fast a nerve impulse or an action potential actually moves down the neuron. 200 miles an hour. Right, but if I need to get from my brain down to move my arm, so from my brain down to my deltoid here to here doing 200 miles an hour is just about instantaneous, but technically it's not. There is a pause between the thought of I need to move and then the impulse of actually moving and then showing up and causing muscle contraction. All right, so if we're going to say that this system, this entire system is made of individual cells, we need to diagram those cells. So let's diagram ourselves a neuron here. There we go. Perfect. So this is still 5a. Boom. So I'd leave yourself some space up here, okay? And the neuron has what looks like a flowery end. Like this. That's one end of a neuron. And then there's this long, thin structure in the middle. Then you have these extensions out here on the end. Now, floating in here is cytoplasm. Floating in here is rough ER, smooth ER, vesicles, vacuoles, okay, ribosomes, right? So this is a cell. This is a neuron cell, okay? So you have the nucleus, of course, but that's the only organelle that we're actually going to draw. But understand that there are the other organelles floating in here as well. So this extension here, this is called a dendrite. And this is where information comes into the neuron. And then this area here is called the soma or the cell body. So this is the soma. This is the more common term, but you will hear me refer to it, if I'm not paying attention, as the cell body, like such. Okay. And what happens here is the nerve impulse arrives here. So the action potential arrives here. Now this is on the membrane. And then migrates along the surface of the membrane until it hits the axon. Now, if the action potential were to move down the axon, then the action potential would take more time. So what happens here is proteins are wrapped around the structure in the middle, like such. And these are made of a protein called myelin. And whenever you wrap something around something else, it's called a sheath. So this is the protein sheath. This is a myelin sheath. And what the myelin sheath wraps around is called the axon. So you guys ever swim in a pool where there's a deep end and a shallow end, like a public pool? And they want to keep the children in the shallow end? What's an easy way to keep the children in the shallow end? How do they do that?
Something in between.
Sure. And what do they commonly put in a pool in between the shallow end and where the pool starts to get deeper?
I know how it looks, but I do not know the name.
Have you ever seen a pool where they put a rope across that area? Or what swimmers call a lane marker?
Yes.
Yeah. And how do they keep that lane marker from sinking?
It has those like
balls.
yeah, like balls.
Yep. Little plastic floaties, yes? Okay. So if you've seen that, those are called lane markers, okay? If you've seen a lane marker, that is exactly how the axon looks with the myelin sheaths wrapped around the axon, okay? With the lane marker, you have rope, and then wrapped around the rope are these floaty things, these plastic balls that make the rope buoyant and separate either the lane or the deep end from the shallow end. Fine. It's the same idea here, that you have this long, thin axon, and then you have these myelin sheaths covering the axon. Why? Because then instead of the impulse just going along, what can the impulse now do? It can skip. And going back to your core, what do we call the skipping? There's an S term for that. You remember that? Saltatory. That's what they're talking about. Hopping or skipping. This is the saltatory action. Okay. The impulse is skipping along. Okay. And then these exposed areas here of the axon in between, this is referred to as a node. So the exposed areas on the neuron are called nodes, and that's where the action potential or the nerve impulse jumps. Now, have you ever seen a sloth? What are sloths known for?
Being slow.
Being slow. They're not unintelligent. They're slow. Okay? They sit there and they go, oh, I should move over there. And then they start moving, but they don't move real fast, right? Because they're sloths, right? And they move really slow. Why do they move slow? They don't move slow because they are unintelligent. They move slow because their neurons aren't very myelinated. They are myelinated very, very little, which means that for a sloth neuron, the impulse has to jump, 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 jump. And so since it's having to jump more often, it's slower. So their nerve impulses are slower. Thus, they move slower. You ever seen a cheetah run?
Yeah.
Crazy fast, right? You now know the anatomy why. What can you tell me about the neurons of cheetahs?
They're covered in myelin sheaths.
Myelin. Yep, myelin sheaths, okay? The faster an organism can move, the more myelinated their sheaths are, okay? Excuse me, the more myelinated their neurons are, okay? So this whole idea about you can't teach speed, that's why coaches say that, right? You can teach technique, you can teach strategy, you can't teach speed. You either have it or you don't, all right? So then what causes the myelin sheaths? Genetics. Hand-eye coordination is based on genetics. Hand-eye coordination really comes down to these little suckers right here. So anybody says, oh, you've got good hand-eye coordination, the person goes, oh, well, thank you. I'm going to shut up, right? It has nothing to do with you at all. You got lucky and received the genes that myelinate your neurons. That's it, okay? Whereas if any of you don't have very good hand-eye coordination, don't take any responsibility for it. You go, hey, I got a gene that doesn't myelinate my neurons very well, okay? Now, there are certain diseases, they're called degenerative diseases. And when things degenerate, they break down. And so something like multiple sclerosis, okay? The reason why people who suffer from multiple sclerosis, the reason why they lose control of their body is because their immune system breaks the sheathing down. So when an impulse goes to a muscle group, right, like your shoulder, there's 8, 12 different muscles that all need to work together simultaneously. So when all of those impulses come out of your brain and go to your shoulder, if some neurons are myelinated, but some aren't, the impulses arrive at the shoulder at different times, and you then become uncoordinated. That's why people who have degenerative neurological disorders, they become uncoordinated. So they tend to move very, very little, or if they do move, it's very methodical, and they move very slowly because they're giving their slowest neuron time to then react to what they think. And they go, take your time, and they move very slowly and very deliberately. So if you guys could figure out how to block the immune system from attacking these myelin sheaths, then you will cure muscular dystrophy, and you will cure multiple sclerosis. Kind of a big deal, okay? So what we are going to focus on then, since this is a neuron, we're going to focus on what's called a motor neuron.
Wait, Mr. Monroe.
Yes.
Going back to the saltatory thing, from the image, it looks like the action potential is jumping out of the cell and around the myelin sheaths. Is that
Right.
actually what's happening?
Kind of. There's some biochemistry that we need to explain. What's happening actually here is back in core 2, we talked about the oh my gosh, the sodium potassium pumps and how they pump sodium and potassium in and out of neurons. Okay, those are the sodium potassium pumps that sit in the surface of the neuron membrane. So what happens is the channels open here. It's called depolarizing. And then that causes the channels to open here, which then causes the channels to open here, which then causes the channels to open here. And so what we see is this jumping of the impulse, or we see a wave going across the surface of the cell. It is identical to when we sit in large crowds, when we get to do that again, and we do the wave, right? The person next to you, right? You're simply waiting for them to jump up. And once they jump up, you jump up, right? And then once you jump up, the person next to you jumps up. Are you physically connected?
No.
No. But if you stand on the floor of the gym, what do you see go across the bleachers?
The wave.
You see a wave. This is the same thing, in that this depolarizes, then this depolarizes, then this depolarizes. And so we see an action potential jumping from area to area as the surface opens up. That makes sense? At least right now. There's more to this that I promise this will make more sense once we talk about the sodium potassium pumps we should talk about that on Wednesday. And then before we talk about the motor neuron, I need to label this as the terminal or the terminus, depending on how you refer to it. So this is a motor neuron, and what this does is this controls skeletal muscle. There are many different kinds of neurons. One type is a motor neuron that affects or controls skeletal muscle. So myelin sheathing is really important with skeletal muscle because it's the myelin sheaths. Such an interesting word to say, sheaths. The more myelin you have, the faster the action potential can move across that neuron. So if you put myelin sheathing with hand-eye coordination, what's the relationship between myelin sheathing and hand-eye coordination?
Direct.
Direct, totally. It's a direct relationship. The more myelin sheathing, the faster your hand-eye coordination. Or the opposite is also true because it's a direct relationship, or the less myelin sheathing, the slower your hand-eye coordination. I went to high school with a gentleman named Jimmy Tatum. And Jimmy, when he was about 16, 17 years old in high school, could throw a ball 80 to 90 miles an hour. He eventually made it to the pros and played for the Colorado Rockies. And Jimmy would laugh because he would just stand on the mound and go, "Here comes my fastball right down the middle of the plate." We knew where the ball was going to be, and we couldn't touch it because it was going too fast. Okay, it's humbling. I knew exactly how to, stand on the balls of your feet and shift your weight and rotate your hips. And I mean, I know exactly how to hit a baseball. And since he had more myelin sheathing than I did, I couldn't touch it. It's just amazing. So some parts of being an athlete are training and dedication and, oh man, just hours of practice. And other parts of it are genetic. And the genetic component separates those of us that are athletic from those of us that are athletes. So that's, if you ever have the chance to meet a professional athlete, it is it's humbling. They are on a whole nother biological level. All right, so we need to get to figure 47, 48. Where's that image? 48, 13. Figure 48, 13. Shows you the neuron. I should have that image around here somewhere. There it is. Go back in there. May I take this handout?
Yes.
Cool. And there's 4813. Now, what they've done here, though, is they have cut off the terminal, so there's not a terminal here at all. So here is, what is this big ball here?
Nucleus.
That's the nucleus. And, oh, let's see, let's do the bag here. Let me put that, no, right about there. What do we call this large part of the neuron here? There's this area here called?
Dendrite. Oh, no, wait. The soma.
Yeah, that's the soma. So, oh, I'll get back to the dendrite. So this is the soma, or the cell body, same thing. And then these structures here that receive impulses, this is a dendrite. This is where the information comes in to the neuron. These then are your myelin sheaths. Like such. And then they show you the exposed part of the axon here. Thus, these are the nodes, such. And then here is the shaft of the neuron here, referred to as the axon. And then the impulse is received here and then moves, or the fancy word is propagates, down and then hops along the surface of the neuron like such. And I wish that they would have showed you the arrows starting here. So the nerve impulse is received here. There is some action potential from another neuron, and that action potential starts moving along the membrane of the neuron. So if you stand in a pool, visualize yourself standing in the shallow end of a pool, right? So the water's here, fine, okay? You're standing in the shallow end. Look at the surface of the water. Think of the surface of the water as the plasma membrane of the neuron, okay? So if you take the surface of that water, you take the plasma membrane and you smack it, what will then happen across the surface of the water?
A ripple effect.
Yep, a ripple, a wave will go out. That is an action potential. An action potential is a response on that part of the membrane that then causes the next part of the membrane to respond, the next causes the next part of the membrane to respond. And so this response moves across the surface of the water. Standing in the gym, looking at the bleachers, a student moves, and a student moves, and a student moves, and a student moves. What do you see? You see the movement of students shoulder to shoulder activating the next student. You then see a wave move, or you see a wave propagate across the crowd. We call that the wave. In biology, that's an action potential or a nerve impulse. It's the same thing, right? And then what we will get into on Wednesday is, how does this biology actually work? How does this impulse move or propagate along the neuron? It has to do with the flow of ions and anions, sodium, potassium, and even a little chlorine, but we will focus just on sodium and potassium. So we will return to core 2 and talk about the sodium potassium pump that we talked about, oh my gosh, about a year ago. And I think that's a good place to stop. So the exam registrations are all taken care of. That's super, super cool. No mistakes, huh? Nicely done. And core, we will do topics 1 a week from today, and then we'll do topics 3 and 4 a week after that. So let's see, Tuesday. Hey, that's Super Tuesday. That's election day. Do any of you get to vote this year?
No, none of us are
No.
18.
None of you are 18?
No.
My boyfriend turned 18 the day of the election.
Now, even though you're 18 on the day of the election, you still weren't allowed to vote?
I looked it up and they said that if you showed up, if you pre-registered and then showed up and showed them an official ID, like a military ID or any type of official
Driver's
ID,
license.
they would let you vote.
Okay. Did you get pre-registered maybe?
Oh, I don't know if he did. It was my boyfriend who turns
Oh,
18.
okay. Oh, get that boy to vote. Come on.
Yeah.
Good deal.